As I'm eager to state on this channel, every nation and culture gets its lifeblood from a mythos. These are stories that depend not so much on exact verifiable truths, but instead emotive recollections of events, battles and moments of heroism that talk to the soul of a people. In England we have plenty of obvious examples of this. St. George fighting off the dragon, King Arthur and Camelot, King Alfred and the formation of England, and more recently Churchill's so-called bulldog spirit and World War II. Now we're living through a very interesting period in history at the moment. As the boomer generation gets older and Zoomers enter the cultural fray with little to no connection to World War II or even Britain before Tony Blair's cultural and demographic revolution, the World War II mythos that's framed the morality and cultural coordinates of Britain and the West at large is shifting. This has all exploded recently due to the war in Ukraine. The mainstream media in the West has taken the typical line we tend to take, and that's that just like World War II, Iraq and Afghanistan, we're fighting unmitigated evil. We're the Allies, they're the Nazis. You may have noticed in the Ukraine situation that the mainstream Western media is eager to align Zelensky with Churchill and Putin with Hitler. However, this mythos is falling apart at the seams for two reasons. Number one, many Westerners look at their nations today and wonder if World War II really was about mass immigration and pride marches. Not to mention, our leaders across the Western world seem to despise their historic cultures and peoples and want to replace them. It seems odd to many then that after being demeaned for being patriotic decade after decade, they're now expected to go and fight a foreign war that they don't know much about for causes that don't really serve them. And number two, for anybody who's been paying close attention, Putin also seems to claim that he's fighting Nazis. He's riffing on the Soviet mythos that they conquered the Nazis in World War II, which of course speaks to the soul of his people and inspires them for war. So as much as we have a brutal physical war taking place in Ukraine, we also have a war of stories taking place on the global scale, the biggest moment of which recently being Trump's smackdown of Zelensky, signalling America was now telling a new tale. And it's worth noting, in one of those stranger-than-fiction moments, the bust-up between Zelensky and Trump happened in the Oval Office, all overseen by the bust of Winston Churchill. That was a gift from Tony Blair to George Bush to solidify the US-UK relationship and reaffirm that both countries share an ideological mythos. Now, to bring all of this together, in the Western world we have the mainstream narrative, which will stand by Ukraine for, quote, as long as it takes, and on the fringes, increasingly anti-Ukraine voices, even pro-Russian voices. Now, it's not uncommon on the right to see this fall into out-and-out veneration of Russia and Vladimir Putin. And in one sense that's understandable because many people on the Western right have for decades now, since secular liberal globalists undermine the spiritual essence of their nations, globalists who see their nations as rootless economic zones with no loyalty to their people who are actively replacing them at this point. And these people see in Putin a European leader who actually will stand up to globalist liberalism. He actually does seem to care about his nation, its history, its religion. Secondly, there's a weird old world charm to Russians exemplified by this video, which you really have to guess where it comes from. Strong, tough men, bare-chested in freezing weathers as a bear props up a trunk for them to work out on. Now all of this begs a question. For those of us on the Western right who value things such as tradition, nation, family, peoples, religions, are we right to see a fellow traveller in someone like Putin? Or are we falling into an illusion, a trap, because we've been so abused by our own globalist leaders, we're desperate to find somebody who shares our worldview and is making a go of it? Worse still, is Putin and Russia potentially actively against us? You can see what I'm talking to here in this tweet from Lawrence Fox. I guess you'd describe him as what, the sort of Tommy Robinson, populist right, libertarian worldview. He's obviously got a meme of Putin here saying, as they say in England, Allah Akbar, the implication being that Putin wouldn't stand for such nonsense. Yet as Novara Media's Aaron Bastani correctly points out here, Russia's got far more mosques than any European nation. The closest to it is Germany with 2,800. Obviously, I'm not counting Turkey here. That's Eurasia to me, not Europe. Next up, this is a video that's doing the rounds on X at the moment, featuring the people that Putin has put into occupied parts of Ukraine. Notice anything interesting? I thought it was the globalist West that was going to flood Ukraine with peoples from different cultures and backgrounds. Further still, many here in the UK are rightly concerned about our liberal overlords implementing effective Islamo-blasphemy laws in the country. We often think Russia wouldn't fall for such madness. Well, here's a story from Russia. Mosque protesters dressed snowmen in niqabs. Now they face 5 years in prison. And here's Vlad himself letting people know his thoughts on the Quran.
Это святыня для мусульман и мусульманская святыня. И для всех других тоже должна и является святыней. Мы знаем, что в других странах поступают иначе. Не уважают religious чувства людей.
Now, as I've said before on this channel, I don't believe in the burning of holy books at all, Quran, Bible or anything. I think it's cruel and needlessly incendiary, but I wouldn't want to see people be sent to jail for it. In Russia, this fellow got 3.5 years for burning a Quran. Yet all of this gets to the heart of Russia, which is to the Western mind a confusing and strange country at times, and I think this is well exemplified in the philosopher Alexander Dugin. Some people view him as very influential on Putin, some not so much. I personally think he is, but in a subtle way, but I also think Dugin's thought gets to the heart of the issue with Russia. Now, if you ever really take the blinders off, whether you like him or you hate him, and listen to Putin, it's really quite fascinating because you'll see a figure who 1 minute will be sounding very traditional, very right-wing, very conservative, and then he'll jump in the same sentence to sounding almost woke, very post-colonial, aligned with very much of the radical Marxist left in the West. Now, you'll find the same dynamic in Dugin as well. Dugin is the creator of the fourth political theory, the aim of which is to overcome the corrosive individualism of liberalism. It's also to overcome the innate class struggle in the Marxist worldview. It's also to overcome the over-focus on the nation, the tyranny that can be embedded in fascism. Now, Dugin's fourth political theory is rooted in Heidegger's notion of design. Now, I'm not going to get into that because it's very philosophically heavy, but for shorthand, it just means rooted in being. There's a mystical, metaphysical element to it, which, again, is very aligned with traditionalism. So, Dugin, to me, is very intriguing on the one hand, but almost repellent on the other. Now, that description I have for my views on Dugin is typical of an Englishman looking at a Russian. It could describe the whole of the relationship between England and Russia. We do find Russia very intriguing, but also mysterious, strange, vast, repellent. Now, moderns tend to have forgotten this in the West in our unipolar, liberal worldview, but the Russians sure as hell haven't. You may have noted that Putin often refers to the UK and the US as Anglo-Saxon. Now, I think in England we quite like that because the powers that be here have effectively banned us from recognising our own Anglo-Saxon roots. However, in America it is something of an anachronism now. Only 20% of Americans these days come from English stock. Yet this tells us something very important about how Dugin, Putin and his acolytes view the West. They do view us in ethnic terms. They view globalism and liberalism as a poison stemming from us. It's also worth mentioning that in the fourth political theory, Dugin is very eager to express that Russia is a Eurasian country, not a European one. I think Putin has taken this on board as well, and it means that they prefer to see themselves as part of the traditional world, a multipolar world. It's why you get rhetoric like this from Russian Defense Minister Sergei Lavrov. I do not want to sound anti-European, but over the past 500 years, all tragedies in the world originated in Europe or occurred owing to European policies. Now, it's hard to believe that Sergei Lavrov simply forgot that Russia and China had communism, the worst tragedy the world has probably ever seen. Took well over 100 million lives between those two countries in the last century. And if you follow Dugin on Twitter, you'll see he's often making strange claims such as this: New Zealand belongs to the Maori people, that should be the law. In essence, you'll see the Kiwis over there of English and European stock as, quote, Anglo-Saxons, and they've all got to go home in his eyes. But as many people have pointed out before, the Maori haven't been in New Zealand as long as the English have been in England. Not to mention the Maori took it over from another group by force anyway. Dugin also retweeted this recently. Events over one weekend were enough to remove the doubts, if any, one had about the destructive, evil, wicked, cunning and harami side of Great Britain. Britain was, Britain is, Britain will be the most evil nation when it comes to geopolitics. It is at the heart of every global problem humanity faces today. If one were to use analogy of Mahabharata, Britain should be finished in the same way as Dushasana. For reference, Dushasana is a figure who faces the most brutal death in the Hindu epic, the Mahabharata. Yet while Dugin is seemingly wishing for the destruction of the Anglo-Saxons, he also comes out with these boomer liberal takes from 2015 such as the globalists are the real racists. This all forms part of his multipolarity idea. That's the idea that the world is turning into a situation where we have differing regions of power. The West will no longer be number one and will have to share power equally. Now, I'm not against that idea in principle, but it doesn't really seem to me to correspond with human history, and I'm not quite sure it's what the Russians would want either. However, I hope you can see the point I'm trying to make in this video. Dugin and Russia by extension are doing many things that I quite like. I appreciate the traditionalism, the thinking outside of globalist modern Western liberalism. However, at the same time, I don't think we should completely trust them either. I think they have their own worldview, I think they view us a certain way, and I think it's very dangerous to align ourselves with them. Of course, it goes without saying that I don't want war with the Russians. I'd like to see peace in Ukraine and ideally peace with the Russians, but I do think we should have our own sphere of influence and we have our own unique tradition. In essence, I guess the point I'm making is it's up to us to reawaken our own tradition rather than looking to the Russians for theirs. Of course, reawakening that tradition, personal and spiritual transformation, is a key focus on my Substack. Do check that out down below if you're interested. Other than that, do let me know your thoughts about this and do consider subscribing to the channel if you're new.